What's going on, guys? So in today's video, we'll be exposing the 2017-18 NBA voters whose ballots were made public by the NBA on June 26, 2018. And to start, we'll be looking at the NBA's Rookie of the Year voting, which came down to Ben Simmons of the Philadelphia 76ers and Donovan Mitchell of the Utah Jazz, and featured a few questionable ballots. The first one being from Mark Berman of the New York Post, who is the only voter to have Ben Simmons third on his Rookie of the Year ballot, all because he didn't view Ben Simmons as a true rookie, which he had stated many times that season on Twitter. But if that is indeed the case, then why didn't he just keep Ben Simmons completely off of his Rookie of the Year ballot, as well as his All-Rookie first team? And please keep in mind that this is the same voter who boasted about turning in a blank Rookie of the Year ballot back in 2011 because he didn't believe that Blake Griffin of the Los Angeles Clippers was truly a rookie. Next is Flavio Tranquillo of Sky Italia, who is the only voter to give Donovan Mitchell a third place vote by selecting Jason Tatum of the Boston Celtics ahead of him. Then we have Eddie Sefko, who is the only voter to have Dennis Smith Jr. of the Dallas Mavericks on a Rookie of the Year ballot, where he gave him a third place vote ahead of Jason Tatum and Kyle Kuzma, which isn't surprising considering the fact that Eddie Sefko was covering the Mavericks as a beat writer for the Dallas Morning News at that time. Furthermore, Eddie Sefko was also the one voter that season who kept Jason Tatum from being unanimously voted onto the All-Rookie First Team and instead voted for Dennis Smith Jr. of the Dallas Mavericks, Lonzo Ball of the Los Angeles Lakers, and Lauri Markkanen of the Chicago Bulls. Now, in staying with the All-Rookie team, another questionable ballot featured Dillon Brooks of the Memphis Grizzlies, who received his one and only All-Rookie First Team vote from none other than Ron Tillery, who is covering the Grizzlies as a beat writer for the Memphis Commercial Appeal. Now, the next category that we'll be looking at is the NBA Sixth Man of the Year voting, which only featured two questionable ballots. One being from Frank Isola of the New York Daily News, who is the only voter that gave Fred VanVleet of the Toronto Raptors a first place Sixth Man of the Year vote ahead of Lou Williams of the Los Angeles Clippers and Eric Gordon of the Houston Rockets, who put up much better numbers that season. Then there's the second questionable ballot, who was from none other than Eddie Sefko of the Dallas Morning News, who coincidentally enough was the one and only voter that season that gave Mavericks guard JJ Barea a Sixth Man of the Year vote. Now, the next couple of ballots that we'll be looking at come from the NBA's Most Improved Player of the Year voting, where Weiping Zhang of CCTV surprisingly gave Toronto Raptors guard DeMar DeRozan his one and only Most Improved Player of the Year vote, while his teammate Pascal Siakam received his only vote from Michael Grange, who covers the Raptors for Rogers Sportsnet. Next is the NBA's Coach of the Year voting, where Doc Rivers of the Los Angeles Clippers received his one and only Coach of the Year vote from Elliot Teford, who is covering the Clippers as a sports writer for the Southern California News Group. Now, the next category that we'll be looking at is the NBA's All-Defensive Team, starting with Sean Devaney of the Sporting News, who is the only voter that season to have LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers on an All-Defensive First or Second Team ballot. Meanwhile, Manny Navarro of the Miami Herald had Damian Lillard of the Portland Trailblazers and Donovan Mitchell of the Utah Jazz on his All-Defensive Second Team, ahead of players like Klay Thompson, Patrick Beverley, Marcus Smart, Drew Holiday, Jimmy Butler, and Victor Oladipo. Then there's Dennis Scott of TNT, who is the only voter to have Will Barton of the Denver Nuggets on an All-Defensive First or Second Team ballot. Next, we have Gary Washburn of the Boston Globe, who had Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder on his All-Defensive First Team, while Keith Pompey of the Philadelphia Inquirer, Mark Berman of the New York Post, and Reggie Miller of TNT had Russell Westbrook on their All-Defensive Second Team ballot. However, the biggest surprise from the All-Defensive teams that season revolved around Russell Westbrook's teammate Andre Roberson, who received a total of 14 All-Defensive votes despite playing in just 39 games that season. These voters were Jackie McMullen and Kevin Pelton of ESPN, Mike Ganter of the Toronto Sun, Amin El-Hassan of ESPN, Anthony Slater of The Athletic, David Aldrich of TNT, Diego Martinez of Reforma, Eddie Sefko of the Dallas Morning News, Gina Mazel of the Denver Post, John Schumann of NBA.com, Kevin Harlan of TNT, Richard Walker of the Gaston Gazette, Royce Young of ESPN, and Scott Bordeaux of the Arizona Republic. However, for many of these voters, the inconsistency on their ballots can better be observed when their all-defensive selections are put alongside their Defensive Player of the Year ballots. Like Brent Barry of TNT, who had Al Horford of the Boston Celtics second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst forwards, and second to only Rudy Gobert amongst centers, but then didn't include Al Horford on either of his all-defensive teams as a forward or as a center. Which doesn't make sense, especially when that's juxtaposed to a consistent ballot like that of Salt Lake Tribune writer Tony Jones, who also had Al Horford second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst forwards, but unlike Brent Barry, had the presence of mind to put Al Horford on his all-defensive first team as a forward. And while most of the voters that season were consistent with their ballot in that regard, a few were not. This includes Rick Bucher of Bleacher Report, who had Clint Capella of the Houston Rockets third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst centers, and yet didn't have Clint Capella on any of his all-defensive teams. While Greg Anthony of TNT also had Clint Capella third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Joel Embiid amongst centers, but then chose to keep Clint Capella completely off of his all-defensive second team and instead voted for Rudy Gobert as his center. Then there's Ron Tillery of the Memphis Commercial Appeal and Scott Bordeaux of the Arizona Republic, who had Joel Embiid of the Philadelphia 76ers second on their Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Rudy Gobert amongst centers, but then kept Joel Embiid completely off of their all-defensive second team and instead voted for Anthony Davis of the New Orleans Pelicans as their center. Next, we have ESPN's Michelle Beadle, who had Anthony Davis of the New Orleans Pelicans second on her Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst forwards and second to only Rudy Gobert amongst centers, but then left Anthony Davis completely off of her all-defensive first or second team ballot. Gary Washburn of the Boston Globe, on the other hand, had Steven Adams of the Oklahoma City Thunder second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Rudy Gobert amongst centers, but then chose to vote for Andre Drummond as his all-defensive second-team center and kept Steven Adams completely off of his ballot. Then there's Sherrod Blakely of NBC Sports Boston, who had Al Horford of the Boston Celtics third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst forwards, but then chose to put Al Horford on his all-defensive second team behind Robert Covington of the Philadelphia 76ers and Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors. Next is Royce Young of ESPN, who also had Al Horford third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Paul George amongst forwards, but then chose to put Al Horford on his all-defensive second team behind Anthony Davis of the New Orleans Pelicans. And last but not least is Kevin Harlan of TNT, who had Jimmy Butler of the Minnesota Timberwolves third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst guards, but then penciled in Jimmy Butler on his all-defensive second team behind DeJounte Murray of the San Antonio Spurs and Victor Oladipo of the Indiana Pacers. Now the next set of ballots that we'll be looking at comes from the All-NBA teams, starting with Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors, who had a great 2017-18 season and was therefore selected to the All-NBA third team despite being kept completely off of 22 media ballots that season. And Bill Simmons of The Ringer, who was one of those voters, justified his decision on Twitter by pointing to Stephen Curry playing in just 51 games that season, which is the only logical explanation given Stephen Curry's numbers and impact. But if that is indeed the standard that Bill Simmons holds players to, then why did he put Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz on his All-NBA third team when Rudy Gobert played in just 56 games that season. Does that mean that Bill Simmons' magical number in terms of games played is somehow between 51 and 56? And that same question can also be asked of the other voters because of the 22 media members that kept Stephen Curry off of their All-NBA ballots. 15 of them had Jimmy Butler of the Minnesota Timberwolves and/or Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz on their All-NBA ballots, even though they played in only 59 and 56 games respectively that season. Then there's Diego Martinez of Reforma, who didn't have Stephen Curry, Jimmy Butler, or Rudy Gobert on his All-NBA ballot, but instead had Kristaps Porzingis of the New York Knicks on his All-NBA third team, even though he played in just 46 games that season. Meanwhile, Sherrod Blakely of NBC Sports Boston had Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder on his All-NBA second team back in 2014, even though Russell Westbrook had played in just 46 games that season. Furthermore, of those 22 media members that kept Stephen Curry off of their All-NBA ballots, 13 of them were also voters in 2019. And of those 13, 10 of them had LeBron James of the Los Angeles Lakers on their All-NBA ballots, even though he had played in only 55 games that season. So the question to reiterate and ask these voters is, how many games can a player miss before being disqualified from their All-NBA ballot? And does that standard also apply to their all-defensive selections? Because 20 of these 22 voters also had Rudy Gobert, who played in just 56 games that season, on their all-defensive first or second team ballot. And as we've already covered, Royce Young of ESPN and Diego Martinez of Reforma even had Andre Roberson of the Oklahoma City Thunder, who played in 39 games that season, on their all-defensive second team ballot. Now, other controversial voters that season included David Chinaletto, who is the only media member to have Trevor Ariza of the Houston Rockets on an All-NBA ballot, and chose him ahead of players like Paul George and Klay Thompson. Meanwhile, Dwight Howard of the Charlotte Hornets got his one and only All-NBA vote from Tim Reynolds of the Associated Press, who chose Howard over notable centers like Joel Embiid, Rudy Gobert, and Nikola Jokic. Then there's Kyle Lowry of the Toronto Raptors, who received 3 All-NBA votes that season, 2 of which came from media members who coincidentally enough were covering the Toronto Raptors at that time. One being Michael Grange of Rogers Sportsnet, and the other being Mike Ganter of the Toronto Sun. However, for many of these All-NBA voters, the inconsistency on their ballots can better be observed when their All-NBA selections are put alongside their MVP votes. Like Neera Kurana of Excelsior, who had Russell Westbrook third on her MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but then chose to put Russell Westbrook on her All-NBA third team behind Damian Lillard, Chris Paul, and Stephen Curry. Which doesn't make sense, especially when that's juxtaposed to a consistent ballot like that of TNT reporter Kristen Ledlow, who also had Russell Westbrook third on her MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but unlike Neera Kurana, had the presence of mind to put Russell Westbrook on her All-NBA first team alongside James Harden. Now, the first set of voters that we'll be looking at are those who had Giannis Antetokounmpo third, fourth, or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Giannis Antetokounmpo on their All-NBA second team behind Kevin Durant. These voters are Marv Albert of TNT, Casey Johnson of the Chicago Tribune, Matt Weiner of TNT, Jackie McMullen of ESPN, Ernie Johnson of TNT, John Schumann of NBA.com, and Rachel Nichols of ESPN. Then there's Ramona Shelburne, also of ESPN, who had LaMarcus Aldridge of the San Antonio Spurs fifth on her MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put LaMarcus Aldridge on her All-NBA second team behind Kevin Durant. Now, the next set of voters are those who had Kevin Durant of the Golden State Warriors fourth or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kevin Durant on their All-NBA second team behind Giannis Antetokounmpo. These voters are Chase Hughes of NBC Sports Washington, Eddie Sefko of the Dallas Morning News, Frank Isola of the New York Daily News, Royce Young of ESPN, and Sherrod Blakely of NBC Sports Boston. Then we have Neera Khurana of Excelsior, who had Anthony Davis fourth on her MVP ballot, first among centers, but then put Anthony Davis on her All-NBA second team behind Philadelphia 76ers center Joel Embiid. Meanwhile, Jason Quick of NBC Sports Northwest and Thalis Soros of Globo Esporte had Anthony Davis fourth on their MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Anthony Davis on their All-NBA second team behind Kevin Durant. Next are the voters who had Damian Lillard third, fourth, or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but then chose to put Damian Lillard on their All-NBA second team behind Russell Westbrook. These voters include Ramona Shelburne of ESPN, Gary Washburn of the Boston Globe, Michael Wilbon of ESPN, Mike Breen of ABC, Lisa Shen Yang of Tencent, Manny Navarro of the Miami Herald, Rick Bucher of the Bleacher Report, Will Guillory of the New Orleans Times, Weiping Zhang of CCTV, and Doris Burke of ESPN. Then there's Cassidy Hubbard, also of ESPN, who had Damian Lillard fourth on her MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but then chose to put Damian Lillard on her All-NBA second team behind Stephen Curry. Next we have Steve Smith and David Aldridge of TNT, who had Russell Westbrook fourth or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but then chose to put Russell Westbrook on their All-NBA second team behind Damian Lillard. Meanwhile, Cassidy Hubbard of ESPN had Russell Westbrook fifth on her MVP ballot, third amongst guards behind James Harden and Damian Lillard, but then chose to put Stephen Curry on her All-NBA first team ahead of Russell Westbrook. And last but not least, we have Tony Jones of the Salt Lake Tribune, who had Stephen Curry fourth on his MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but then chose to put Stephen Curry on his All-NBA second team behind Damian Lillard. Now, while all of the voters that we've covered are certainly entitled to their own opinions, these opinions, if they are to be taken seriously, should not only be educated, but consistent. And what we've seen from these 2017-18 NBA ballots is that many of these media members just aren't consistent in how they vote, which not only makes a mockery out of the entire voting process, but ultimately takes away from the integrity of the game.
I just want to go on record and say that I miss Eddie Sefko very badly. And he's a wonderful, wonderful man of the highest integrity. And he's a wonderful, wonderful man of the highest integrity.
Oh! Somebody! Oh! He needs some milk!
And wondered why you weren't on it. Thought about getting on it in the future, anything like that.
I thought about it. I think that I do a pretty good job. These 5 years I've been here, I've been showing and showcasing that I am one of the top defenders in this league and things like that. But you know, I don't let it get me too worked up. You know, on things like that. You know, I know what I bring on the court to my team into the game, so I'm not really worried about it if a piece of paper or somewhere line doesn't say that I'm on some type of team that, you know, guys that I don't know who, you know, who just wants to see certain guys there, you know, those type of stuff. It's a popularity contest, and you know, I'm not there to play ball, so I don't need a piece of paper or something telling me that I'm a great defender.